Here we are. Welcome, YouTube family. Taking a deep breath in and letting go. Once again, coming into this moment. So today's sermon is called My First 30 Years, which, as a recap, I already shared it with our group present today, but next week I'll be turning 30. And so these are just a few teachings that I've been applying throughout my whole life that has led into the writing of Living Peace, and now the creation of not only our center in Arizona for 8 years, but here now as the Zen Cowboy in Bayfield, Colorado. So let's go ahead and take one more breath. We just listened to Breakaway by Kelly Clarkson, which it's not so much about detaching from anything. It's more about leaning into our own fears and our discomforts and moving forward in life, which I wanted to start by sharing a quote by Pema Chodron. And so for those of you who have a handout, you're welcome to follow along with me. And then for the video, I'll go ahead and just read it. So, Pema Chodron, the question is, are you going to grow, or are you going to just stay as you are out of fear and waste your precious human life by status quoing instead of being willing to break the sound barrier, break the glass ceiling, or whatever it is in your own life? Are you willing to go forward? I suggest finding the willingness to go forward instead of staying still, which is essentially going backward, particularly when you have a calling in some direction. That calling needs to be answered, and it's not necessarily going to work out the way you want it to work out, but it is taking you forward and you are leaving the nest. She went on to say, and leaving the nest is never, quote, a bad thing, because you're leaving all the shit behind. So if you know bird's nest, there's a lot of build up in it. And so I just love that, because it really is true that a lot of times out of fear, we can often stagnate in our own lives, not only in our own belief systems or in certain relationships that may not be benefiting us, but just it really can stagnate us and keep us from taking those risks, taking those chances, taking those opportunities to get out of our comfort zone, break the patterns of our karmic wounding. So who's ever noticed that you've had some patterns either in relationships or absolutely anything, maybe even in work environments or just with your own family units, to where it's just like the same shit, different day. And it's so difficult to exit that pattern of either subtle or great conflict. And so that's really what this is talking about. And what's interesting is the first thing I have at the top under this week's reflections is actually its own nugget of wisdom, but it's actually a title of a book by Pema Chodron, and it's called Fail, Fail Again, Fail Better. Wise advice for leaning into the unknown. And that word failure is often a trigger word. There's a lot of stigma attached to it. And I don't know about you, but I know for me in the past, anytime someone would just say the word fail, or even when you're growing up as a kid, you get that F on a paper. Hopefully we didn't all get too many Fs, right? But there's just that like societal American stigma of the letter F and the word fail. And what a great disservice that is. Because we make it something to fear, we make it something to push away, we make it something to judge. But in actuality, there are so many times in our lives where we fail to hit the mark, and that's okay. Because it is in the failing that we can actually sometimes learn the deepest lessons. But guess what happens when we fear the word failure? We often cover it up with arrogance. We often cover it up with just an aggressiveness of pushing it away. Because how many of us have actually gone into relationships to where we're trying to point out something that's not hitting the mark, and the other person gets defensive or aggressive and won't even touch it? Because if they touch it, it might make them seem weak. It might make them be very uncomfortable with the idea that they're not doing, quote, good enough. Because on a subconscious level, we're told that if we're failing at something, we're no good. If we're failing at our marriage, we're no good. If we're failing at our job, we're no good. If we're failing at X, Y, Z, it could be whatever the heck it is. But really hear that. I would love it if couples would come into the coaching sessions that I have and say, you know what? We're failing at this marriage. And that's okay. But that's why we're here. And we're not going to be judgmental about it. We're just going to state it factually that we have no way in which we're communicating in a healthy way. How freeing and vulnerable would that be to honor that in a sense without worrying about the judgment involved and just saying, look, here's where we're at and we're ready for assistance. Guess what happens more often? Either one party or both parties just will not admit their effed upness. See the effed upness? The F, you know, there it is again. And it actually keeps the healing process from ever taking root when we cannot fully lean into those moments where we're just like, you know what? I missed the mark. And so really, I love changing the meaning from failure, from the F word, to simply shooting an arrow and missing the mark. You know, it's such a softer approach in that angle, isn't it? But no matter what, think of how freeing it is when we no longer fear the F word. Isn't that interesting? And so that was, since this is, again, going back off of my first 30 years, blah, 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 that was a big thing even as a teenager. Something switched within me, probably around 15, 16, where I just had no fear around failure anymore. And so I would just show up and do these random ass things, no matter the amount of judgment that it would bring. And honestly, I think a lot of it had to do with coming out of the closet and just being like, you know what, I've been through hell and back. I've been called a faggot, an abomination, you know, burning in hell for eternity, and just randomly people saying awful things to me for the past, I don't know, however many years, and learning to just accept that and be okay with it, and that it doesn't have to define me for who I am. So at that point, I'm just like, I got nothing to lose. And so it's kind of the first sermon I ever gave, which again, another F word, but the first sermon I ever gave in 2002, I think I was 22 at the time, or 2011, I just turned 22 when I became a pastor at the time. It was letting your freak flag fly. That was the first sermon I ever gave. And it was all talking about that if you don't actually show any authenticity, then how are you going to attract that authentic match in your life? How are you going to attract the people that are going to love you for you? If you never actually tell anyone your full honest feelings or show the true you, how is anyone ever going to know the true you and can love the true you? And so I think it's tenet 8. Release knowing, which the teaching is mask removal, removing all the masks and all the ways in which you're trying to present such a perfect image to the world, and just allow people to develop a relationship with all aspects of who you are, and not being afraid of failing or not being afraid of that judgment, and really leaning into that. And that's what then leads to the creation of places like this. That's what then leads to the creations of relationships like this. That's what then leads to the creation of actually having peace in our lives. But if we're always trying to sugarcoat something, if we're always trying to cover something up, then is it any wonder why so many of us feel like there's a little bit of insanity on a daily basis, not only within just looking at the world, maybe even at our jobs and our relationships. There's just so often things that are not hitting the mark. And a lot of it is not in full resonance because it's almost like we all have this like tuning fork within us that can tell when something's not hitting the mark. But we can't always put our finger on it because so many of us are so afraid of judgment or so afraid of, it could be anything, but we never let the absolute honest feelings out on the table. But then there's danger that comes with that as well, because who's tried to be like really honest before and it just went south so quickly? Where you actually are like, okay, I built up the courage to tell my full feelings in this relationship or the situation or whatever it is, and it's just become such a hot mess. And then you feel pain around it, or maybe even raised with parents that maybe one parent said to cry is a weakness or to show emotion as a weakness, and that anytime you tried to express your true feelings, they were invalidated by the parent. Because again, the parent wasn't able to lean into that. Maybe they were doing a shitty job as a parent. And again, it's okay that it's not a judgment that they're doing a shitty job, but it's important to have that fact and realize that, you know what, maybe it's true that I'm not doing X, Y, Z for you. And so let me lean into this relationship and treat my child as an equal rather than viewing them as a subordinate to me. And let's have a conversation. Maybe I can learn something from this. A lot of you have parents like that were really vulnerable and opened up to, and you're able, or was it more of just this is the right way or the highway? And then you often got beaten down if you did not follow this quote status quo. And then how many of you may have gotten into marriages, relationships like that later in life, to where there was just such a structure, and anytime you felt something was out of alignment, it was met with more conflict than actual deep ability to listen. Unfortunately, in the older generations, that is often the case. And it's not anyone's fault. It really just comes back from that's where society was at that time. And now the ways that we're raising the next generations is changing, and they're going to have their own problems probably because there's never a perfection there. But going back to my point is that how many of us have actually expressed ourselves and it was shut down. And then it develops a belief system to where it's unsafe to fully express myself. And then we again go back into the mask wearing, and then we cover ourselves up, and yada, yada, yada. The cycle continues. And so that's what I share with. The next bullet point is my unconditional belief as a child and as a teen, and then now as an adult, my unconditional belief that inner peace is possible. An unconditional belief that inner peace is possible. That's not a sentence often heard in the world. Even in a lot of religions, peace is not necessarily the main thing that is preached. It might be about, the forgiveness or the mercy or being saved or getting into heaven, or in Buddhism, reaching enlightenment or whatever it could be. There's so many different spiritualities out there, but peace is not always at the pinnacle of it. It might be along the way, but there's often some other overarching goal. And what's dangerous about that overarching goal sometimes is that you might compromise the peace along the journey. That's how you have parents disowning kids who, way back in the day, remember when tattoos were of the devil? Some places they might still be, but shutting down and pushing people away just for that. Shutting down, pushing people away when they might have had a child out of wedlock, or maybe they got divorced, and how damaging that can be to the psyche. And of course, we know people that were disowned just for coming out of the closet from their parents because it compromised this idea of what heaven looks like and who gets to go there. And so we see that there are these belief systems, and we compromise peace along the way because of this overarching goal. Does that make sense? And so at the end of the day, let's now define inner peace and understand what that actually is. So another way of explaining peace is compassion, unconditional compassion, not even unconditional, but just getting to the point of unconditional understanding, unconditional kindness, these things that all religions teach, but oftentimes will cover up along the journey because we have this idea of duality of right, wrong, good, bad, and morality in our mind that then justifies our behavior of unkindness to people. Isn't that interesting? And so here we have this idea of fail better, fail again, and then we have this unconditional belief in inner peace that it's possible. And what that did to my psyche as a teenager going into an adult that then opened a center at age 20, which I still don't know how the heck that happened, but here we are. I made kindness an unconditional action within myself. So kindness was unconditional in action, speech, and thought. And that's challenging to do. Have you ever tried that, to make kindness absolutely unconditional, to where you won't say a thing out of spite to someone, that you won't really say judgments or even really try to recondition any judgments you have in your mind, and then your actions are always very mindful? And so what's interesting is when you make a vow to make that unconditional, it forces you to find new ways of communicating in your life. Because often we all agree with kindness, right? Hopefully, but how many of us actually embody that kindness when we're triggered, when our ego gets pushed, right? Oftentimes, that's the moment that the kindness walks out the door. And so then we justify our lack of compassion, we justify our lack of kindness because of whatever trigger it was. And in this little nugget in my mind on my subconscious belief systems growing up, because I was so tortured as a kid, I'm just like, holy fuck, I never want anyone to feel the way that I felt as a child that went through all of that abomination abuse, that spiritual abuse, that I would cry every single night thinking I was going to burn in hell for eternity just because I was different. How damaging that is to the psyche. And so that's when I'm just like, fuck that. This idea of morality can really, really harm us and really hurt us because we get so attached to the right and the wrong way of living life that we are not even conscious of the unkindness and the lack of compassion that we're having to people that are different from us. And as Duncio Andrew shared at the beginning, right after 9/11, a Sikh in Mesa, Arizona, was shot dead on the side of the road while he was planting flowers in front of his gas station because of the fear-mongering that occurred after the 9/11 attack, even though this man was a Sikh and wasn't even a Muslim, but he was wearing a turban, and there you go. So it's not necessarily hate that is the issue here. It's our ignorance, our lack of understanding, our inability to fully lean into the uncomfortable parts of our ego, the uncomfortable parts of our relationships, the uncomfortable parts of our patterns that not only cause abuse within ourselves, but cause abuse to others around us. And a lot of times, all that abuse stems from is our own unprocessed pain, which you can call the karmic patterns of things repeating, and then things repeating, then things repeating, then things repeating, often going down generations and generations. It's interesting. We develop belief systems that our family or parents had just because that's what we're taught. And then if we're not the black sheep of the family, then we might just kind of go into that. But when you're the black sheep or the rainbow sheep or the alien sheep, you get thrown out of that. And then you look back and you're just like, wow, there's a lot of pain here that's not being addressed. And so that's why here at the Zen Cowboy and in the living peace that we teach is it's all about, without going out and trying to save the world and all these things, because you can get caught up in your own right view and then you may not even be fully listening to what the people are saying. I always say, go back to your home first. Focus on the home and inviting peace not only into your own heart on a daily basis, but every single person that's already in your life, the people that are already there, especially your family and the people in your inner circle. See how you can start practicing this unconditional kindness, because chances are they probably trigger you more than strangers. Because just the way that this works out, the people that are closest to you, you most often spill your bullshit on. And so understanding this and just leaning into this in a compassionate way. And I hope you can hear the words, even though I say fuck or bullshit or shitty, I hope you can hear that my tone behind them is not really a judgment. It's just stating it as a fact and acknowledging that it's okay that this here exists. And we want to lean into it. We don't want to push away. We don't want to judge it. We just want to say, okay, this behavior within myself is existing. Now what? It is so painful to fully acknowledge it and to realize where we're getting that letter F in our life. But when we start to transform the definition of failure to simply missing the mark, it's not the end of the world. It's not an attack on our identity. It is just recognizing areas of growth that can be possible in my life, that can lead to more peace, not only in my life, in my work life, in my marriages, in my relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the three things that kind of led into the formation of becoming, I guess, who I became as an adult, is this just unbridled non-fear of failure. And then this idea that inner peace is possible. And then this idea that that kindness can be unconditional at all times. And sure, there's parts where I definitely missed the mark, but more often than not, because this was my number one focus. Every single day I wake up, I would drive my mom crazy. Both my parents crazy, because when I still live with them, every freaking day I would run down like, guess what I just wrote? And I was like writing about peace and all these things, and then I would post on Facebook, because before I had a book, I would always post on Facebook a lot and then just share these teachings that were coming out of the blue. And then I started turning them into sermons. And then we had a beautiful congregation of 50 people, literally from day one when we started our church in Arizona in 2011. And so it just showed me that, my gosh, thank goodness I wasn't afraid of failure, because who does this? You know, and then what married gay couple that are, I guess you'd call us Buddhists, for lack of a better word, that are Buddhists, move to a rural town in America and open a place like this and, you know, go against the grain, so to speak, even when there is a huge counter movement of people speaking against it. But then none of this would exist. None of this would exist, and the people that are in resonance with it, receiving peace in their life and enjoying it, would not exist. And so it's not always about going the easiest path. It's about going, like Pema Chodron said, is there a calling in your heart? Not so much chasing our lusts, not chasing our desires, not chasing these things that if we don't get them, they're going to cause us to suffer, because who's been in addiction before? Excitement is not peace. Pleasures, not happiness. This is more about that quiet inspiration, that quiet intuition that wells up within us, where we say, there's something here and I want to explore it a little bit. And yes, I might be a little afraid and uncomfortable with it, but let's go ahead and go in this direction and explore it. And then you get us, and here we are. And then you get all of you, because all of you, even just coming to this building, coming to our services here, stepping out of the ordinary, isn't it? Very fascinating. So that is delicious in and of itself. So let's take a deep breath in. So a couple more things I want to define before we wrap this up is when we make kindness unconditional in action, speech, and thought, what it does is it creates a mirror effect. Because a lot of times, going back to what I said, to where when you've opened up to people and it just goes south because they get angry or whatever, and then you get angry, and then it just turns into quite the repeated pattern of battling. When you maintain that peace and you're able to maintain that unconditional kindness, and even though the other person it might be an ego lashing out at you, what it does, if you're able to maintain your equilibrium there, is it creates a mirror to where if you react to them, it just proves their own rightness. Because if they're out of alignment and then you become out of alignment, then it almost like cancels each other out and there's really no mirror effect going on. But when you're able to keep your alignment, even in the most difficult, dire circumstances, and there's a lot of conflict, a lot of emotions around, and you're able to keep that, what happens is you become a clear mirror. And the person will likely not see it right away. But if you repeatedly do this on a daily basis, and they keep doing the quote awful behavior, eventually there's nothing for them to project that on anymore. Because if you're no longer matching that quote awful behavior, because that's often something that you could say, well, look, you did this to me, right? Who's ever said that to someone before? Lashed out and they're like, well, you did this, and then it justifies. If that's not going on around you anymore, then there eventually comes to a point where there's only one person that the person can now look at, and it's their own behavior. But that's really hard to do, isn't it? And that's why my book is available for $15. But that's why there's teachings out there that teach us the ability to actually drop into peace and sort out our own neurosis, sort out our own patterns and the ways that we are triggered, so that we really can be that clear mirror for the people in our lives, versus constantly falling into the trap of conflict and conflict and conflict and conflict and conflict and conflict and conflict, etc. I can keep going. But recognizing that that is a beautiful way that it's possible for that to occur. It won't always. Maybe they're not ready to face their stuff, and that's okay too. But I also want you to recognize that peace does not mean being a doormat. Who's ever done that before? Where you just learn to keep the calm in a household, you learn to keep the peace, but you feel awful. That's not peace. Because if internally you are not at peace, that's not real peace. What that is you're faking calm. And so when we stop faking that calm and we're still practicing this understanding of peace, which is showing up and having those difficult conversations and not losing our shit, even if the other person's losing their shit, that's where change starts to come from. Because so often people confuse peace as enabling. People confuse peace as being a doormat, just biting their tongue all the time. But it's not peace when there's all this torment going on inside of you. And it often turns into immense suffering and depression over years. And so it's this healthy balance of being able to show up and repeatedly have these conversations, but at the same time, repeatedly being that ability to be a clear mirror and not falling into the same pattern of the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And one of two things often occur where transformation starts to come into existence, or you do your best and things start to go like this. And that's okay, because Pema Chodron teaches, the thing that we don't want to do is just stagnate in the same shit, different day, the same nest where all the shit builds up, but allowing everything to move forward, whether it's a transformation in the relationship for everyone's peace involved, or to transformation in these relationships to where they might be going in a different direction, and that's okay too. And that's okay too, because if you're someone that is repeatedly in an abusive situation, Sometimes removing ourselves from it is actually really helpful for the other person, because for the time being, that person's no longer developing that same pattern of abusing someone. They might go find someone else because patterns repeat. But in that moment, when you remove yourself from that abuse, what ends up happening is actually a really beautiful thing that Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, to where now that person doesn't have someone to repeatedly abuse every single day. And so it actually does elevate and raise consciousness and vibration for the planet. Isn't that interesting? To think where we're often like, well, if I stay here, I'm helping them. When in actuality, it's the opposite, to where we're enabling the same patterns and continuing on and on and on. And so that's why it is so absolutely it's of necessity that we show up and we have these difficult conversations and allow things to start to transform and to transmute. Interesting stuff, isn't it? And so that right there, that little nugget, that last nugget, is what allowed me to actually enter into a very healthy marriage, because the many people I dated along the way, and some of which I may have actually could have married, now they weren't necessarily bad individuals or wrong individuals, but that pattern was there. The pattern, the seeds of abuse that would have led into the future, that possibly could have actually made me also abusive, because often if one person is, then you get wrapped up into the drama, and then you start to lose your mind. It just gets crazy. Being able to practice this consistently forced me to break those patterns within myself so I wouldn't fall into that. And then, of course, first months, we knock this stuff out and we understand how to communicate. Never speaking in a tone once to each other, never having an argument, never speaking one word of disrespect to each other. And that's the unconditional peace that I believed was true as a child. But then all of my friends that I've seen, not only every single age, get into abusive relationships because we don't think that a peaceful relationship is actually possible. Interesting, isn't it? We think that there's excitement, we think that there's pleasure, we think that there's the sense of security and sense of love, but often peace is not at the top of the list. And that's what I really want to leave all of you with today, to start making peace your number one. Not love, peace, because love can be used in a lot of twisted ways to justify twisted behavior. But when you make peace the number one thing as your moral compass, it allows you to actually keep your behavior more aligned along the way, while also being aware of the behavior that you're being surrounded by and making sure that we're not enabling that as well. Fascinating stuff. So let's take a deep breath in. So those are just a few nuggets that my first 30 years taught me, and how to show up to what we're doing today. And I thought those were a few nuggets that were relevant to pretty much everyone. And so I hope some of you got to take something away from that. And I'll go ahead and look at the camera for a few seconds. It'll be a little awkward. Hello. Thank you all for joining in. And as always, links are down below if anyone would like to donate. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. And thank you as always. We'll see you next week.